My name is Kabage Karanja, architect, curator, and educator, co-founder and co-director of Cave Bureau, based in Nairobi, Kenya, and was involved with the curation of the British Pavilion.
And I'm Stella Mutegi, sort of the same things that Kabage does, I do. We are architects based in Nairobi. We are researchers, we are educators and curators. And for the British Pavilion, we were co-curators.
So the acronym GBR is sort of where it really began, GBR being the acronym for Great Britain, but also re-looking at its meaning in terms of Geology of Britannic Repair. And the idea with that, as in the broader theme of our curation, which was to look and address architecture as an earth practice that is not dislocated, but has a fraught relationship as being extremely extractive from the earth, as opposed to operating with the earth. And so the main principle of the curation was to reflect on that broader theme. We invited participants who we felt fell in line with that philosophy, broadly speaking. And through that, identifying specific research modes and practices that in some shape or form directly touch on thinking about architecture as an earth practice.
Just as Kabage has said, GBR being the acronym for Great Britain. Coming from Kenya, there's also quite a close relationship because we are a former British colony. And so, yeah, that's one of the main, not the main themes, but one of the themes that was quite strong in the pavilion. So there's also just that relationship between where we are placed geographically in Kenya, and the Rift Valley passing through, and being a former colony of Great Britain.
So maybe starting broadly speaking, I think with the collaborative task, as Stella highlighted, between Kenya and the UK to create a pavilion, what became very clear and apparent, and that's tied to our research, is looking at decoloniality and the modes and means of practicing that in real terms. The pavilion, in many respects, has in the past as well as the present represented the pinnacle of empire, pinnacle of colonial extraction, which is still ongoing. So for us, we initially came to begin thinking about curating the pavilion with a bit of trepidation, a bit of excitement, and a bit of tension. And so what's exciting with regards to our repertoire of research and work practice over the years is not shying away from these difficult questions and taking these stories, taking these narratives and hard discussion points to the horse's mouth, so to speak, and the horse being historically, the symbol of empire. Even if at that, this stage of time, we are in a sort of different existence, so-called state of independence, there's still unfinished business when you look deeply at where we are as a world. And architecture, for the longest time, has either ignored it or has been ambivalent to deal with the discourse of architecture being a tool of not only resistance, but now a tool of repairing that. And so I think at the heart of it was to think of how this curation could, in many respects, incumbents a former colonial government and a sort of state of empire to reflect on its past, number one, but think about what reparation might mean, repair, and how that can manifest through an architectural thought process with different ideas of participants thinking of what that might look like in different parts of the world. And I guess, as Stella had highlighted, the Rift Valley was the key point of reference, which is the origin of our entire human species. And it's from that point we string together the narrative.
Just adding on to Kabage's elaboration is, coming from the research we do, the Anthropocene Museum, which we've done for the last almost maybe 8 years. It's looking at the effects that man has had on the earth, and for us looking more closely to our geographical location, again, Kenya, but also at the communities that are most vulnerable to these effects of climate change. And so, because that's a really big theme in the Anthropocene Museum, it's, the first room that you got into was to just show the perspective of what all the countries in the world, it didn't matter which country you're from. Once you got into that first room, you could look for your country and see how it's contributing to climate change, by carbon emissions. So we had that room that placed countries in relation to the carbon they emit. So, that was something we explore quite a bit with the Anthropocene Museum, and especially working with these local communities, vulnerable communities that are having to adapt from their way of life so that they can sort of, start, I guess the word is adapt, yeah, adapting to the changes that have happened, and as a result, changing to even the way they have historically or ancestrally lived. So some of those projects we are working on in the Rift Valley. And maybe as we talk more on this, we'll get into some of those details. But yeah, that's one of the themes, the Anthropocene talks about, and how we did incorporate it into the pavilion.
I think that really went to the heart, actually, of our curation in relation to what we were doing. Because the map in the legacy of empire and colonization used the map to really accelerate, operationalize, and actualize colonial projects throughout the globe. And so it's a loaded tool, as you say, with regards to the trend now to think of counter mapping and ways that we can reimagine how we see the earth and how we relate to the earth. It's become even more pertinent to think about mapping and what mapping means, especially within the practice of architecture. So fundamentally, when you think about what the core of our curation was looking at, was to really define a new relation between geology, architecture, and people. And so at different scales, the tool of the map was operationalized. As highlighted by Stella, room 1 was probably our largest map, which was a sort of carbon footprint map, which we used the building itself to realize the map itself, not only as a compass to orient yourself, but a marker in time using African logics of scarification on the body, but now on the body of the pavilion, to then now represent that. And then going to other rooms like room 2, where we had this large upturned map of Africa, specifically focusing on the geology of the continent and thinking about the mineral wealth and geological wealth fundamentally of Africa as still a site of ongoing extraction and exploitation, beginning to use that in the continental scale. So from the global going to the continent. I think the map even translates further in different ways as you go into the room and the different rooms from parts, the Palestine Regeneration Team room, and how they represent and look at the offshore natural resource that has actually attracted most of the attention on that part of the world, which we're seeing now manifesting as an ongoing genocide. And that was represented within the space, within that room. And it continues. The map, even in Tandi's room, as on the wall, a reflection on geography, geology, thinking about, space and the mapping of space and debris in that sense.
I guess it's also a way to think of places or spaces differently. We get what we, as you mentioned, we get a lot of, or we have grown up looking at conventional maps, whatever conventional means. And you realize they are conventional conveniently, if that makes sense, when I give, like, for example, just the map of Africa, the way it is with all the national borders, the borders of the different countries, these were spaces that were not defined before colonialism. Maybe mountains defined, the land defined itself. Rivers would define a place, a lake would define a place. But we didn't really have boundaries. And so when these boundaries were then put, you'd find that more often than not, conflict was the result of that. And so even with the map that Kabage is talking about, the one in the second room, room 2, where we've turned the map of Africa upside down, or as other people would say, but for us, it's not upside down, because in space, there's no up or down. You can view the world in any direction you want. In fact, if we wanted to put the map of Africa sideways, it would still be fine, because, you can view it from any side. And so we stripped all those boundaries and used, as Kabage has elaborated, the form, the physical features of the continent, and then superimposed areas of conflict where there's been conflict on that continent, and more so concentrating along the Rift Valley. And you find it's the places that are so rich in minerals. That's where the conflict comes. So that already tells you a lot. So it's unpacking some of the narratives that we have gotten so used to that we don't question. One of the biggest themes of this pavilion was architecture as an earth practice. It's always going back to the earth and how, as Kabage has said, we relate to the earth.
When you bring into discussion this idea of an earth practice and architecture intertwined within it, it basically forces architecture to come into dialogue with the complexity of a fragmenting world that's in crisis, both socially, materially, and resource-wise. You cannot dislocate it completely. So when you're talking about materials, and talking about, let's say, an ongoing war in different parts of the world, it's all tied together because it is to do with either wealth, resources was sort of growth or an aspired growth and ambition to grow certain capital. And material is the primary subject of that. So in a way, through this curation, in many respects, we're arguing the point that even with the building itself, when you think about its manifestation as a brick building, that had prior to it, the use of it fundamentally as a tea house. When you think about that, which was basically the essence of it, and the capital that tea and exploitation of tea in Asia resulted in. The actual very root and heart of the pavilion itself is tied to that material extraction, that material exploitation. And so what we end up doing and trying to translate that, as much as it's a lot to communicate, we do it in simple ways, like stripping the building on the inside in room 2, where we expose the brick by cutting away the plaster and exposing that heart. So it's exposing that interconnection with that logic of the earth, wealth, translated to as an expression of what the immense extraction on the earth system was celebrated. It was celebrated as this architectural artifact on the landscape, and the British Pavilion as the highest point in Venice is not, it's not an understatement in terms of the elevation of the land. That's the highest point. I mean, there are obviously higher buildings than it. And so what we are trying to unpack and unravel is this discussion. And probably Stella can describe in a lot of detail to do with the portico curtain. But in a way, it was about this language of materials interconnectedness and the responsibility as well, in a way, of practitioners in the creative realm, where in most part we do depend on material use, to think deeply of how these materials are linked and what broader geo stories they have to do with this very complex history and disturbing present that we're going through right now. And so I think there was a constant, rehashing of that point in the different rooms, right from the front and right into the middle.
I think for us, it was also just representing underrepresented or completely ignored architects. Let me actually call them architects. And these are people who'd never get to a table where, you've gone to university for 5-6 years, you're registered by your, registration board in whichever country you are that allows you to practice as an architect. They would never feature in such a place like Venice Pavilion, the Architectural Biennale. And so we brought them to the Biennale. One with the beads that, the curtain that sort of partially covered and partially revealed this neoclassical building. We went back to vernacular practices of building. The Maasai women, who are generally the ones who build their houses in the Maasai community. And this is a pastoralist community, so they ancestrally moved from place to place, but that is slowly dying off because obviously, land tenure has also changed quite a bit, as brought about by colonialism. But it was using that simple way of building. But when you look at a lot of vernacular architecture, they lived 100% with the earth. They extracted very minimally from the earth. And once they were done, whatever is left goes back to the earth and it is regenerated and renewed, and you can come back many years later and reuse the same one, which is very different from, the way we build now. It's extremely extractive. The construction industry contributes more than 40% of carbon emissions. So that already tells you a lot. 40% is quite a bit. And so it was like a gentle reminder of these earth practices that many communities, and I would say mainly vulnerable communities, that continue to still build with the earth, still practice architecture as an earth practice. And so the beads we brought in were made by Maasai women, but we also had charcoal briquettes. We had briquettes that were made from recycled vegetable waste. So again, when you think about charcoal, which is used a lot in Africa, and its destructive nature, because you have to cut down a tree, slow burn it to get the charcoal. I mean, it's extremely degrading to the environment. And so we have a lady here in Kenya that we worked with who runs an eco solution to your conventional charcoal from timber. And she uses recycled vegetable waste. And so it was just a gentle reminder of how, when we really do look back at these vernacular ways of practice, there's a lot that modern architecture right now can borrow from, as opposed to, what happened. And I'm sure it happened in India as well, where there was a lot of illegitimization of your way of life, how you build. Some of those practices that were then illegitimized are the practices that architecture needed to borrow from and use, so that this relationship between architecture and the earth is it's not extractive as it has been over the years, and we can see the catastrophic effects of that. And so that was like a gentle reminder of this and I'll put it in quotes, non-architects that are the sustainable architects, really. But then also looking at practices that were there and have sort of died because modern architecture came and it was apparently better. And so in room 3, the weave room, where you saw the big weave of the Shimoni cave, this was a collaboration with Phileas and the Royal Danish Academy, looking at how some of these forgotten and ancient weaving techniques can actually be used in modern architecture. So we had this installation at the Louisiana Museum in Denmark, and we got a part of the weave brought into the British Pavilion. But it was showing how, as simple as the weaving technique is, you can still get really complex geometries, because this was an exact replica of the Shimoni cave in woven form, 1-to-1 scale. So, and this was a Kagome weaving technique that was used by the Japanese. I suppose a way of looking back at things that were done right, but how can we then use those techniques, those practices in modern architecture without being as extractive as we have been over the last 100 or so years. something Catherine Yusuf said in an interview we had during the opening week, was that it was the speech she gave, the opening, when the official opening of the pavilion, was that it would be good to see, we had the Kenya-UK collaboration. Next to the British pavilion is the French pavilion. So she would like to see, France and Cameroon collaboration, Germany and Angolan collaboration, Belgium and the Congo. As a way, it's, I think, a very tiny step in getting into this unfinished business. And I think for the British pavilion to have been open, first of all, to collaborate, that was good, but then to collaborate on such provocative and often shied upon topics and be open to display that, I think was one big step in the right direction. It's like scaling the Himalayas. It's just, we are starting now, but we've got a whole big mountain to scale up and get to the top and then descend. But I think it was, what's the word? I don't know what word to really use, but then again, for the Biennale to have given a special mention for to the British pavilion, I think speaks volumes about that tiny step that was taken in this collaboration. So I think it would be interesting, and it would be interesting to watch what that little step, what it's going to do to not just the British pavilion, but to the rest of the pavilions and to the rest of, places, institutions that are grappling with some of these things. Just, I think 2 weeks ago, Nigeria, received back from the Netherlands a lot of artifacts that were ideally stolen, and they're being returned. I think there's these little baby steps happening all over. There's sort of a goodwill, maybe somehow, I don't know, but there's something that's shifting, because, if you think 20 years ago, this would never have been a discussion. Absolutely not. Returning artifacts, what do you mean? You can't take care of them. So I think it's a small step in the right direction. So I suppose we wait and see where that goes and where it leads to.
The exhibition, in a way, was an indictment on Britain, in a way, to not only be a mark in the sand, but to express that there's a lot of unfinished business in relation to not only the returning of artifacts that exist within the British Museum that have not been meaningfully repatriated, restituted, but equally in terms of the impacts of colonization and the British Empire in general. No meaningful repair at all. No meaningful, even deep justice-based account of where the state of Britain is right now. And that also even compounds and effectively, exponentially gravitates when you think about climate change and the discussion about decarbonization and the responsibility of the most polluting countries to think about repairing that, to reverse that. And what that repair looks like is to really support communities who are most vulnerable, but communities who also deserve meaningful justice and payment to deal with what we are right now facing on a global scale. It might be very fanciful and wishful thinking, but in a way that's basically fundamentally what the exhibition was exposing through an analysis of the pavilion itself as a building, but thinking of it and unpacking the geo story of the building itself. And so as much as the collaboration was really fantastic, and we had good reception from visitors of all age groups, I think fundamentally we were opening this chapter again, but in a much broader scale, a broader platform that would hopefully encompass, leaders to think deeply of these geopolitical complexities. If we are to say we need to live on this earth sustainably, this needs to happen. It cannot be just lip service for one segment of society in the world against the other. It needs to be a really collective offer and reflection on the fact that the civilization project has failed flat on its face. And as Stella was highlighting, indigenous knowledges and practices of ways to build need to be upscaled and thought through in research development to then impact ways we build not only here, but globally, without being condescending about a vernacular past, which was very, very critical and meaningful in terms of where we are as a human species, but that we need to transcend that time with new ways of making and thinking.